Last week, I was speaking with someone after church, and we were talking about how they were thinking about their finances, especially since their situation had recently changed. And the questions that they were asking were all about how to ensure that they weren't falling behind in their goals and in the ways that they wanted to be a part of God's mission. And I loved that conversation because it was specifically focused on making sure that our money doesn't master us, but we can master our money. And that is the series that we just started last week. We looked at different financial stages that you can find yourself in over the course of your life. And I talked about last week how when I got out of college, I had some decent debt and a not so decent income, and that put me squarely in the struggling category. Or maybe you can relate with the surviving category where you're living paycheck to paycheck. You're taking care of the bills, but there's not much left over after all of that to save up for the future. Now, some people will connect with the stable category, where you're not only able to take care of your regular financial needs, but you're also able to put some money away. I mean, maybe it's not tons, but you're able to save up for that vacation, or you're able to put a little bit into a retirement fund each month. And the secure category is characterized by being able to make big purchases with cash because you're able to save up regularly. And then we get to the surplus category, and that's where you start thinking about money strategies for growth and investment because you have more than you need. And last week, we also talked about the final stage is when you're actually thinking about how to make an impact with the resources that God has entrusted to you. And that stage is called significant. Now, last week, we introduced 5 biblical principles by the author and financial counselor Ron Blue. And these 5 principles helped us experience transformation in our lives during these weeks of this series. And so I'm going to ask Ron to recap it for us again. Sorry, let's go ahead and restart this video one more time.
Tell us what those are and talk a little bit about this. Ron, among your many discoveries, one of them that I read is there are 5 biblical financial principles. Tell us what those are and talk a little bit about this.
Well, the interesting thing is sometimes you don't know what you know. And I was testifying before a congressional subcommittee in the early 90s. Senator Dodd from Connecticut was doing the interviewing. And his question was, what would you tell the American family about their money? And right off the top of my head, I thought, what I'm going to tell him is going to make him laugh. So I said, Senator, I would tell them to spend less than they earn, avoid the use of debt, build some margin into their finances, and set long-term goals so that they could prioritize their money between the short term and the long term. And I stopped at those 4 and looked up, and Senator picked up his pencil and he wrote them down and he repeated them back to me. And then he said, well, it seems to me that that'd work at any income level. And I said, you're right, Senator, including the United States government. And we had a great conversation on that. But those 4 principles, when you add to it, give generously, are 5 biblical principles of money management. And the illustration of it works for the government, it works for the single mom, it works for the billionaire, it works in Africa, it works in Japan. Those are like biblical principles. Those are transcendent principles. Live within your income, avoid debt, save, set long-term goals, and give generously. And they're never going to change. They're always going to be relevant, and they're always going to work.
So let's go over these 5 biblical principles once more. Spend less than you earn is the first one, and I'm going to need your help. We spend what? We spend less than you earn. We avoid debt. We do what? We avoid debt. We build margin, which means what now? We save. We set long-term goals, and we give generously. Ron tells us that these 5 principles are going to help us get to the next level in our finances, no matter where you currently are. Now, last week, we dug into number 1, spend less than you earn. And so if you missed that last week, I really encourage you, go back, watch it online, because we don't want to miss the beginnings of the foundational principles and practices that can transform your financial strength. And today, we're going to look at number 2 and number 3, avoid debt and build margin. So to begin, I want to remind you of something we also talked about last week, and that is peer pressure. We talked about how peer pressure causes us to push beyond our limits, and that can get us into some dangerous situations. But another thing it does is it causes us to think that certain things are just normal because, everyone is doing it. And then years go by, and we look back, and the things that were normal back then, maybe we look back now and realize that was pretty dumb. Take, for instance, fashion trends. I have some pictures I want to show you, and so I want to put the first one up. This is from, I think, the 1960s, and I'm curious how many of you might have rocked some of the fashion in this photo. Perhaps the flowered dresses or the quintessential, is that the Jackie O hair, I love the little girl in the front with the knee-high white socks. Did anyone in here wear knee-high white socks when they're young? Willing to admit it? Oh, hey, we have a couple of people willing to admit it. Would you also wear those knee-high white socks today? Would you? Maybe next week you could come back. Maybe you wouldn't want to now. I have another picture I want to show you. This is from the 70s, I think. And you can tell it's the 70s because of the super wide, what are these, collars? The double-layered collar. Did anyone rock a double-layered collar in the 70s? Anyone willing to admit it? Or maybe the big hair. Did anyone have the big hair? I love just all the coordination of the colors and stuff. Mustaches are starting to come back. And I have one more picture for you. This is another kind of maybe questionable fashion choice. And oh my gosh, that's Gary Sandrock. I didn't even realize that. I didn't recognize him with all that hair. I'm so sorry. I don't know how that made it into the slideshow. That's really sorry. I'm so sorry. But the mustard colored shirt was a choice. Yes, it was a choice. I'm sorry about that. We're going to take that down. We won't include that in the live stream, maybe. See, back then, you might have thought that it was pretty cool. You fit right in with all the rest of the crowd. You were in the culture at the time. You were on trend. But now you might look back and cringe and go, what was I thinking? You might even look back and say, oh my gosh, that was dumb. And I wonder what else is normal now that we might look back on in a few years and realize is actually dumb. And here's one that I think that we'll realize is pretty dumb and that we were all wrong about, and that is debt without discussion. Debt without discussion. See, we have a debt-driven society, and I'm swimming in it just as much as anyone else. But we need to be praying for the day when we realize how foolish this way of life is. And so I want us to listen to Ron discuss this.
So why do I need to spend less than I make in a world that lets me spend more than I make?
Well, yeah, we have redefined being able to afford it. Now, being able to afford it means I can make the credit card payments. And again, I've lived long enough and I've seen us become a debt-driven society. I mean, look at our government as an example. And people, where do you go that they don't offer you a credit card so that you get a 10% discount on this particular purchase, and now they've got you. And so there's no real encouragement to not overspend. I need it, so, and it's so easy. So it becomes, I really think also that people need accountability in order to hang in there on a lot of this. It's hard to do it by yourself.
It is. It's even hard to do it by yourself if you're, as a couple, you agree. Even as husband and wife, if you agree, it's still pretty tough.
It is, but it's worth it.
Our culture has redefined what it means to be able to afford something to now mean, well, I can afford the payments. And so now we barely even think about the overall cost and weight of what we've taken on because we're not looking at the overall amount. We're just looking at the monthly payment. We're just looking at it's just a little bit of interest. And so whatever stress or weight or worry we might feel is washed away by this new shiny thing that we get to have right now if we only sign on the dotted line. And our debt-driven culture has made it easy to sign up for new debt. So easy that all we have to say is, I need that, instead of being honest and saying, I greed that. Pastor Kevin had a great point. I wrote it down. I want to put it on the screen for you. He said, the problem with greed is that it masks as need. The problem with greed is that it masks as need. And once you say you need something, it's a lot easier to justify. St. Francis of Assisi said, people have confessed every sin to me except greed. And the point is that you can't see it in yourself. Greed hides itself. So I figured maybe we should just get it out there. I'm capable of greed. Anyone else willing to admit that? You willing to raise your hand and say, I'm capable of greed? Now, if you're raising your hand, go ahead and look at your neighbor who's not raising their hand and help them be honest. I'm capable of greed, right? Because we're all capable of greed. All of us are. And that's because there's ads and commercials and displays and influencers that say, hey, you don't have this yet and you need it. And we don't even need to leave the house now to fall prey to this because of online shopping. In fact, I don't even need to pull out cash or swipe a card because I can just click the button. And then it gets shipped straight to my house like the next day. I don't even have to think about it. It's already there in my life. Move on to the next thing that I now want. And to get really real, I probably should confess something to you as your pastor, that I also deal very much with justification and greed in my life all the time. Just this week, which is ironic because I was preparing this message, it's actually just this week, I made a rather large purchase of something that I had convinced myself I needed. Because you see, we live on an acre now, having moved here. And for someone who just moved here from California, an acre is a lot of grass. Like that's a lot of grass compared to my yard back in California. And the grass that we had in California, it's always in a drought over there. And so you have to water it to encourage it to grow. Not here. We don't have that problem with grass here. It grows so much. And we didn't have a mower. And I mean, I didn't want to hire someone else to mow it for us either, because I was a little too proud for that. But really, to be honest, I just didn't want people whispering about that California pastor that can't even mow his own lawn. And so I asked my neighbor to borrow his mower, and he had a really nice mower. And because I was looking at the yard, it was looking like we were about to invite snakes into our life if we didn't take care of it quickly. Anytime the kids played outside, Ollie could get lost in the thick foliage of our lawn, and he thought he was exploring the jungle. He was having a great time. I was having a panic attack, not knowing where the 2-year-old was. And so I borrowed my neighbor's mower, and I mowed, and it felt great. It looked great. I was proud of it. And Megan said, wow, the lawn looks really good. Good job, Drew. I started strutting around the house with my chest puffed out, like I was a man. I mowed my lawn. And wouldn't you know it, it grew back like 3 days later, like so quickly. There was more grass out there and I had just mowed it. And now all of a sudden I'm in the position where I need to borrow my neighbor's mower again. But this time I feel bad because I can't keep doing this. Am I just gonna have to borrow his mower like every 3 days? And then I'm thinking about, how am I paying him back? And so anyways, I decided to call Aaron Gonzalez from Peabody's and talk to him. And I picked out a brand new Cub Cadet ZT1 54-inch mower, riding lawnmower, 0 turn. Oh, it's great. Here it is up on the screen. I mean, just look at that. Look at that guy up there. So happy. Big old dumb grin on his face. Not even thinking about, yeah, money's a little tight right now, but you know what? It sounds good to add some monthly payments to my life for the next 3 years. Why not? Fully financed, 0% down, next day shipping. It is great. See, honestly, this isn't the worst thing I could have done. I know I'm being a little facetious, but the point I'm trying to make is that I had convinced myself that I needed it. I had fooled myself into thinking that I needed it, when in reality, I could have just swallowed my pride and kept borrowing my neighbor's mower while saving up for my own. Or I could have gotten a used one on Facebook Marketplace, or honestly, I probably could have even gotten away with a push mower. I mean, it is only an acre, would have taken like 17 hours, but I could have done it. I could have done it, but I justified my decision for all the reasons so that I could say, I need that, rather than I greed that. And when we get into the self-deception of greed, it can do us all sorts of harm. Now, we also can get ourselves into harmful decisions. In 2011, there was a 17-year-old Chinese student who was so convinced that he needed a new iPhone and a new iPad that he sold his kidney on the black market. Now, complications from the surgery caused him to go into renal failure and probably be bedridden for the rest of his life. And when his mom asked him why he did it, he simply said it was because he needed the phone. Greed masks itself as need. And you might be amazed at that story. You might think it's absurd. You might think, oh, I would never do that. But what are we doing today that we might later on look back at the picture of our decisions and think, that was dumb? See, the Bible talks more about money than faith and prayer combined because God knows how much of a pull money and greed can have on our lives. And so today, in our Jesus story, we're going to see how the way that we feel about money is a direct expression of our faith. Pastor Kevin put it this way. I wrote it down. It says, your faith is expressed and authenticated in the way you earn, spend, manage, give, and hold money. I hope you had a chance to look up Luke chapter 12. It's on page 57 of the New Testament if you're using the black seatback Bibles. And we're not going to read the whole chapter, but I do want to give you some context for the passage that we are going to read. And so back in chapter 12, verse 1, it starts with Jesus talking to a massive crowd, thousands of people. And he's talking in the beginning part of the chapter, he's talking about not being overcome with the worries and stress of this world, to not live in fear of gaining or losing material things in the material world, but to focus instead on the eternal qualities of life that is secure in the kingdom of God, the type of life that Jesus offers. And while he's talking about not being consumed with material things, a guy in the crowd thinks, well, I know someone who needs to hear this. And so he raises his hand and he interrupts Jesus. So let's read together, starting in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. But he said to him, Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbiter over you? And he said to them, Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's funny to me that in the beginning of the chapter, there's a guy listening to Jesus talk about not being overly concerned with money and stuff, and he immediately figured, oh, that message is for somebody else. Like we do that, don't we? How many times have you left church and said, oh, I need to send that message to my friend? I know exactly who needs to hear this one. I'm going to share this with my mom. I'm going to send this to my son. Some of you have even said that to me before in the last couple of weeks. See, Jesus is talking about not being overly consumed with money or stuff. And this guy pipes up and says, yeah, my brother is too focused on his stuff. So Jesus, can you tell him to give me some of it? You know, spread it out. See, now this guy was probably the younger brother because in that culture, the older brother was the one who would step up and assume responsibility of the estate for the rest of the family. And since this guy is asking Jesus to talk to his older brother, it's safe to assume that the older brother is probably there in the crowd. And so Jesus has this opportunity to directly apply his teaching to help an older brother overcome his obsession with stuff and to divvy up among the family. Because after all, the tax collector, Matthew, he had left his job and lifestyle to follow Jesus. Zacchaeus had paid back all the people he had defrauded. And so here is another chance for Jesus to help create life change. But Jesus doesn't do what the guy asks. No, in verse 14, he says, well, who made me the arbiter and judge? See, instead, he focuses on the thing behind the thing. And in verse 15, he says, be on guard against greed. And then he says a doozy of a line that we all need to hear today. So I want you to write it down or underline it or, just make some note of it somehow. Because he says, one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. See, Jesus is saying that our life is not made up of the stuff that we have. And if we're following Jesus, then we've got to trust that what he says is true, that life is not about how much or how little stuff or money that we have. And even when he had the opportunity to talk to someone who had a bunch of stuff and say, well, this stuff has the potential to enslave you. So why don't we divvy it up and spread it out among your family, and that will protect you against that. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he says, protect yourself against greed. See, but we hear that and we see how the world just shows us a picture of life based on money and things and status. And we say, well, if no one's going to give that to me, well, that's okay. I can still get it. I'll just debt my way into it because I got to have it. See, Ron talks about this in his book. And I appreciate the way he says that. I want to put Ron's quote up on the screen on slide 19. It says, debt is not a sin. The Bible discourages the use of debt, but it's not prohibited. Being in debt is never the real problem. It's only symptomatic of the real problem. The real problem is usually greed. See, Ron also talks about the fact that when we go into debt to get something that we want, we're usually doing it to try and make our life better. But going into debt usually has the reverse impact than we intended. So I want us to hear Ron explain it to us.
You made a statement that I thought was intriguing, that people often use debt to increase their standard of living, when in fact it can actually lower your standard of living.
Yeah,
Can you explain that?
I can, because let's say that I run up a credit card bill or car debt or something of $5,000, and now I'm paying interest of some amount on that. And what happens is that because I borrowed the money, I didn't have the income, but I have to pay it back with my income. And I have to pay it back with after giving dollars and after tax dollars and after interest dollars. So I have to pay back more than what I got. And it's all with after tax dollars. So I have to lower my standard of living in the future by borrowing in the present. It says, well, I have it, yeah, but it's cost you a lot in the future. You have mortgaged the future, and it's cost you more in the future than if you had waited, saved the money, and paid for it.
See, we're trying to raise our standard of living, but the impact actually ends up lowering our standard of living. And remember, we're talking about this, we're asking these questions because we want to know what financial stage we are in currently and how to get to the next step. We want to know how to get from struggling to surviving or from stable to secure. But no matter what the world may tell you, I want you to hear this. You cannot borrow your way into the next step. You cannot borrow your way into more financial strength and security. when we try this, instead of going forward, we actually go backwards. And if we want to protect against this, then we're going to need to do some personal work in our hearts. So I want us to finish by talking about 3 things that we want to protect and protect against. So first, we're going to need to protect from impulse. Protect from impulse. Let's put these 3 on the screen. Then we're going to need to protect from impatience. And finally, we're going to need to protect your savings. So let's hear Ron unpack how we can protect ourselves from impulse.
Everybody hates doing a budget. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody hates doing a budget. What do you say to people? How do you advise people to get into budgeting and living inside a budget? Because spending less than you make is impossible without a budget. Agreed?
Budgeting needs to be done because I need to do it in order to accomplish my goals, not just because it's a discipline. It'll become a habit to you. And if you plan and manage your money, and a budget's just a guide anyway, it's a bunch of pre-made decisions. And once the habits are established, you don't need to do much more with the budget. It's more to get control of where you're spending your money first.
How do you get control of your money or how you spend your money? Well, you make a budget, which is just a list of pre-made decisions. So you decide how to spend your money before you get into the store with the flashing lights and the beautiful things and all the shiny stuff that you want or need. You conquer impulse with pre-made decisions. And we already know what happens when we don't have pre-made decisions with how we want to spend or invest or give our money. We know what happens. We get swayed by whatever's in front of us. It's like going to a buffet for lunch. Does anyone else have the guilty pleasure of the Asian buffet over here in town? Man, I love that place. It is so good, so not good for me, but I love that place. Now, the comedian Jerry Seinfeld, he makes a point about buffets for lunch and how it is so different from the rest of life. Because no one would go into a regular restaurant, walk up to the waiter and say, "Hi, I'd like a yogurt parfait, spare ribs, 4 cookies, and an egg white omelet, please." You wouldn't say that in a normal restaurant, but when you get to a buffet, you see all the things you could have. And so you start going around and getting all the different things. And then you slowly try and make it back to your table without spilling the plate that is towered high with enough food to feed like 7 people. Meanwhile, making a mental note, oh, I got to go back to get that stuff that I didn't see the first time. I'll make room for my seconds. But see, if we do that every single day, over and over again, oh man, we're going to bulge. See, unless you have the willpower of pre-made decisions, you're going to treat life like a spending buffet. And you do that every day, and you will bulge until you bankrupt. That's why Proverbs 22, verse 7, it's a good reminder for us. Proverbs 22:7 says, "The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender." See, if we don't have pre-made decisions to help us conquer impulse, we can enslave ourselves with debt. So I have 2 questions for you to consider today. What spending impulses are conquering you, and what is taking you into debt that can be avoided? Let's put those 2 questions up on the screen. What spending impulses are conquering you, and what is taking you into debt that can be avoided? See, this is where a budget helps. And if you've never made a budget, or if you're like me and you're having a hard time sticking to the budget that you made, the struggle is real, then I want to encourage you to talk to one of our pastors, talk to one of the elders. We want to connect you with help or connect you with training on how to get some more understanding about building a budget and strengthening your financial life. Because this isn't going to be an immediate switch. It's going to take work. See, apprenticing our lives to Jesus, learning wisdom and experiencing how the Holy Spirit can transform our lives so that we can join God's mission, so that we can use our finances for the things that He's calling us into, that is not an overnight process. And that's why we have to be willing to develop patience. And that's the second thing that we need to protect against if we want to avoid debt and be able to build margin in our finances. We need to protect against impatience. So let's listen to how Ron described it.
So, Ron, a 28-year-old man, 27-year-old woman, married for 3 years, come to you. They've saved a few $1,000s and they want to buy a home. They hope to get pregnant, start a family. And it would be an unusual situation if somebody had accumulated $100,000, $150,000 all on their own since college, let alone potential college debt. And they come to you for advice and say, we want to borrow money for a mortgage against the home. How do you counsel them?
Well, I would counsel them to, I would not counsel against taking on a mortgage. Because when you buy a home, you're buying a lifestyle. And so it's a non-economic transaction to some extent. It has economic consequences, but you're buying something other than the house. So my counsel to them would be make sure that you've saved enough down payment so that you can stand the risk of downturns. So I would never counsel somebody to probably buy a home without putting less than maybe 20% as their down payment. So it's called delayed gratification. You may not be able to have it today, but if you plan for it, you're going to have to not spend in the current to have it in the future. That means that's why it's spent.
Say that one more time.
You're going to have to not spend it today to have it in the future. So if you want a down payment on a home, you've got to not spend it today. It's not economically foolish necessarily to rent while you're doing this at all. If you follow those principles, spend less than you earn, avoid the use of debt, and build some liquidity and set long-term goals and give generously, it will work itself out.
So, how do we protect against impatience? Well, you're going to have to practice delayed gratification. And that involves the process of not spending in the current so that you have it in the future. And this principle, it doesn't require teaching, explanation. I'm not going to go into it more, but it does require action, which is why I have two more questions for you to consider. Where are you pretending you can get ahead without practicing delayed gratification? I mean, even if you think you need the 72-inch deck on the mower versus the 52-inch deck on the mower, where maybe do you need to wait? See, knowing that you want something but waiting and then working your way there until you saved up to get it. See, to avoid debt and build margin in our finances, we need to protect against impulse. We need to protect against impatience, and we need to protect our savings. So let's hear from Ron one last time.
You didn't seem to have a problem, Ron, in the book with the idea of getting rich. But in a get rich quick world, you suggested get rich slow.
That's right. Get rich
Explain
slow.
that.
Well, the only way to get rich quick is to be really lucky or to be born into the right family. And most people have to work for a living. So if they live within their income and they do that for a long time, they're going to come out way ahead. I said, look, if you don't spend $83 a month that you could spend and just put it away when you get out of college, let's say, or school, high school, and you do that for a working life, you're going to have saved $40,000 or $50,000. Okay? However, because of the laws of compounding, that could be worth hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million. I can save, it used to be I could save 40,000 and under the interest rates, I could have $1 million when I was 65. Today, I might have 300,000 or 400,000 if interest rates don't change. So I saved 40,000 to have 300,000 or 400,000. Or on the other side, I overspend by $83 a month. It didn't cost me 40,000 over a working life. It cost me what it could have earned, 300,000, 400,000, or whatever. So a little bit over a long time frame works, and you'll end up just fine.
A little bit over a long period of time, and you'll be just fine. See, the problem is, though, that this is contrary to the rest of the world that tells us, yeah, but you can get it right now. But if we want to live like no one else, so that we can then live and give like no one else in the future, then we're going to have to do things that are a little bit different to the rest of the world. And if we don't work to protect our savings, well, the world's going to drive us to spend it all. And then not only will we not have our savings, but we'll still be in a spending mode. And so to keep up with our spending, we'll probably take out some debt. And then we're enslaved to the process of paying back money that wasn't ours to begin with, so that now we can't even make decisions for ourselves for how we want to serve God with our resources. See, this lifestyle of growing our financial strength by spending less than you earn, avoiding debt, building margin, it's not easy, but it isn't impossible. And if you're in debt now, I do want to tell you there is a way out. There are resources to help you learn how to right side your spending so that you can get out of debt and get into savings so that you're freed up to live and give in the way that God is inviting you to. But I do want to remind everyone that we're not doing this to earn anything with God, because debt isn't a sin. A huge retirement account isn't a sin either. See, a spending spree isn't a sin, and being a penny pincher isn't a sin. Money is just a tool that's a gift from God. It all comes from Him. It all belongs to Him. And we just want to make sure that we aren't living our lives in such a way that we are mastered by our money. We don't want to be living serving our money or serving our pursuit of a certain type of lifestyle. Because you can follow God and join Jesus on mission with a lot of money. But you can also follow God and join Jesus on mission with hardly any money. Being wealthy isn't a sign of being more holy or having more favor from God. But on the flip side, having hardly any money, being poor, isn't a sign of being holy or being more pious because of your simple lifestyle. See, what we have or what we do doesn't make us more holy. God is holy. And He's the one who reaches out to us with grace and forgiveness and wisdom, inviting us to learn from Him, inviting us to follow His way of life, inviting us to join in the work that He's doing around us with the resources that He's entrusted to us, giving us His righteousness, giving us His life. And when we realize that all we have is a gift from God, when we realize that God is a good provider who can take care of us and who leads us into a life of goodness and connection and purpose and meaning, we can learn how to master our money and use it for the mission that God is calling each of us to. And isn't that good news?